Fake news, alternative facts, and the post-truth era. These terms have become familiar with the rise of Trumpism and manifold authoritarian regimes coming to power over the world. How to understand the mechanisms of contemporary propaganda today, and what is the role of art and culture in shaping the new realities that we live in. Artist Jonas Staal will introduce examples of contemporary propaganda art in ultra-nationalist and ultra-right regimes, specifically oriented on his exhibition project Steve Bannon, a propaganda retrospective that is still on view at het Nieuwe Instituut in Rotterdam until September 23rd. Jonas Staal, born in 1981, is an artist and the founder of the artistic and political organization New World Summit, 2012 and ongoing, and the campaign New Unions, 2016 and ongoing. Staal's work includes interventions in public space, exhibitions, theater plays, publications and lectures, focusing on the relationship between art, democracy and propaganda. In a way, today's event is a homecoming for Jonas Staal. The building of IMPAKT, the Center for Media Culture, was home to BAK, Basis Actuele Kunst, till 2017. And Jonas Staal organized several projects together with BAK, amongst others the New World Academy and Stateless Democracy. In tonight's lecture on art and propaganda, Jonas Staal will discuss forms of transformative and emancipatory propaganda art in popular mass movements and stateless insurgencies. This lecture will further serve as an introduction on the work of Adam Curtis and the screening of his film Hypernormalization that will be screened here tonight at 7 p.m. After the lecture, between 6 and 7 p.m, there will be a buffet dinner, and you can still buy tickets for that. And Jonas Staal lecture will be about 60 minutes long, and after the lecture there will be opportunity for question and answers, possibility to ask questions. Please, a warm applause for Jonas Staal.
Thank you, Arjan, for the introduction, and to Saskia and Ines for co-organizing the event, and for all of you to come on a nice warm day in which you could also be outside in Utrecht having a beer and chatting with family and friends. And instead you're going to listen to an hour-long lecture on Steve Bannon, the rise of alt-right coalitions the world over, and all the dark news that swept over us this past summer. A possible subtitle of this lecture could have been reading The Guardian with, over the summer with Jonas Staal, because there's going to be a lot of references to recent events. It's also quite special to be in this space. I didn't realize that IMPAKT had moved to what used to be Basis voor Actuele Kunst in Utrecht, which now moved several streets upward towards the station, and here for about from 2012 to 2016 with Maria Lavajova, the still director, but then the director of in this building. We developed many projects together, amongst which the New World Academy that Arjan just mentioned. So there was a specific period in which this room was an intense study room working together with the National Democratic Movement of the Philippines, which leader and ideologue José María Sison is even with us here today, and many other political movements. So also this background to this space is quite special to me. The plans were not there at the time, so things do change over time. What I want to discuss today in this lecture on propaganda art is what I refer to as the contemporary propaganda struggle. What is for me in my research, my PhD research on propaganda art, and my own work as a propaganda researcher and, you could say, as a propaganda artist, it's very important to emphasize that propaganda is not a singular term. There's never one object or artwork or one poster or one film that can be considered propaganda. Propaganda operates on as many possible levels as possible, from the dinner room conversation to the voting booth. And only at the moment that it's really able to construct reality, you can start calling it, referring to it as propaganda. But there's not one type of propaganda in the world. There are various propagandas in the plural. So when I refer to the propaganda struggle, I mean to say that our reality, in part, is created by a conflict of various propagandas, each of which is trying to bring forward its own conception of reality. And what I want to do today is to discuss a few examples of how dominant forms of power or new forms of power create different forms of propagandas, in the plural, and how they affect the domain of art and culture. Late July 2018, Steve Bannon, the former campaign manager and advisor to Donald Trump, announced his creation of a new Brussels-based organization with the aim to become a right-wing alternative to George Soros' Open Society Foundation, a foundation that famously supports liberal and neoliberal political and cultural initiatives. And this new platform, that Bannon ominously titled The Movement, aims to offer polling advice on messaging, data targeting for all the manifold ultra-nationalist and alt-right parties and platforms that at this very moment are trying to unite to dismantle the European Union from within. From Wilders' Freedom Party to Le Pen's National Rally, formerly known as the Front National, and from the League in Italy to the Alternative for Germany. And the Alternative for Germany, of course, the AfD, in this past week has come in the news in a tragic way in their role in enabling the protests of Pegida and neo-Nazi related organizations that in the most tragic of events organized around the Karl Marx boost in Chemnitz at the time that the city of Chemnitz was still known as Karl Marx City. Once again, a specter is haunting Europe, but this time it's not the specter of communism, maybe unfortunately, but it is the specter of the Nationalist International. Now, Bannon's new organization, The Movement, can tell us a lot about the meaning of propaganda today. And when I talk about propaganda, I propose a definition that could that approaches propaganda as a performance of power. Now, there's an interesting artist, American artist, Trevor Paglen, who for many years has tried to document what he considers the substructure of our contemporary society, specifically the substructure of the war on terror. The NSA, the massive NSA data centers, classified locations where military aircraft is being developed. The substructure of power that controls information and has the capacity to censor, circulate, produce new information. The performance of power essentially are infrastructures like politics, the economy, the mass media, the military-industrial complex, that have the capacity to shape reality based on a specific set of interests. This is essentially what Noam Chomsky and Edward Herman in the late 80s defined as the manufacturing of consent. They said the performance of power in propaganda aims to create a normative reality, and this normative reality reflects specific elite interests. The elite interests that hold control over the very infrastructures through which this alternative reality, this manufacturing of consent is brought about. And they speak, specifically in relationship to mass media, of propaganda as something that can be defined through various filters. The first filter, for example, would be monopolization, which means that if you want to introduce a particular narrative, a particular set of attitudes and beliefs in a society, you need to control as many possible communication mechanisms, in this case related to the mass media, to reaffirm time and again through as many platforms as possible the same message. Another aspect is FLAC, another filter, propaganda filter. It's the fourth, which today we would know as fake news. This means the conscious insertion of false information to derail an existing narrative, to derail a mainstream conception of reality. And of course there's the fifth filter, which is the anti-communism filter. Now, Chomsky and Herman developed this propaganda model at the end of the Cold War. So the anti-communism filter was crucial because in order to manufacture consent, in order to create the sense of a collectivity, there's a necessity of an enemy. There must be a them in order to define who is us. Today, the more contemporary version of the anti-communism filter would be the Anti-Islamist filter, particularly in the Nationalist International. Now, the Nationalist International gains power at this very moment, both politically and culturally. What we used to consider as established conservative liberal parties today speak like the extreme right of the 90s. But this is the new normal that we're living, in comparison to the even more extreme standpoints of the extreme right of what used to be the extreme right. What is on the extreme right of the extreme right. And this is how propaganda works, because what we once considered norm is over time re-established. A new reality is constructed by manufacturing consent. What was once unacceptable is now the new standard. And of course here we see Sebastian Kurz of the conservative liberal Austrian People's Party, the ÖVP, standing next to Heinz Christian Strache from the Freedom Party, the FPÖ, a party that was founded by Nazis, that they are now in a coalition government in Austria. And it's important to remember that at the end of the 90s, when the FPÖ was elected for the first time, there was a massive outcry throughout the European Union. There were economic sanctions imposed upon Austria as a result of the FPÖ-led government. Today we are not even having this speculative discussion whether or not such a policy would be legitimate. And in a similar way, we remember Jan Maat, the leader of a Dutch neo-Nazi far-right party in the 90s, who declared the Netherlands is full, was prosecuted for making this statement, suggesting that we cannot accept any migrants from the outside of the Netherlands, prosecuted and convicted for this statement. Today, to say that the Netherlands is full, you would accept that statement from the most mainstream conservative democratic party. So this is how propaganda works. Two components in the performance of power in propaganda are crucial. The first, control infrastructure. This is again an image from the artist Trevor Paglen that I just mentioned, in this case documenting an NSA GCHQ surveillance base in the UK. And the control over infrastructure means controlling the means through which society is organized. Propaganda succeeds when its desired values, attitudes, ideas circulate, I already mentioned, from the dinner table to the classroom, from the newsroom to the cinema, from the voting booth to the drone command center. The performance of power must operate from the micro to the macro scale in order to construct reality in a sustainable way, in order to replace one reality for another. The second component is control over narrative, control over the collective stories that we tell about where we come from, who we are, and who we are to become. Or, in the case of the Nationalist International, the story is also always about who we are to become again. The narratives of the Nationalist International are in that sense strange retro science fictions. They always refer to a past greatness that never really existed in the first place and then project that as our collective future. Make America great again. There's a suggestion that there was a greatness that never really existed in the first place, and it somehow has to be projected as our common future. And of course, we see in many components within the Nationalist International this kind of similar reiteration and glorification of a fictional past. Here, for example, is Marine Le Pen standing, giving a speech at the May 1st demonstration in 2014 in front of a huge poster that says "No to Brussels, yes for France," in which Jeanne d'Arc blows away the stars of the European Union. And of course, often to Le Pen is often referred to as the Jeanne d'Arc of the Front National, of the Nationalist Unity Party, extreme right party. So there is this idea of a kind of almost a mythological reinvention of a past greatness. This narrative dimension of propaganda, however obscene or obviously falsified, it cannot be underestimated because it is crucial to mobilize a collective imagination that legitimizes the construction of a new reality. And it is here that the narrative and imaginative power of art, of visual art, literature, cinema to design, even an example of a poster like this, shows a crucial importance. Now, Steve Bannon himself, the founder of the movement, is an example of a propagandist and a propaganda artist, because his work has focused on both developing the infrastructures for the Nationalist International, but also the narratives that provide a purpose and a unity to this growing international alt-right alliance. And what I'll be sharing with you are some images and case studies related to the work, the propaganda and propaganda artwork of Steve Bannon from the exhibition that Arjan already referenced, of which you see here the poster. A very important aspect of Bannon's work on an infrastructural level is his employment by Goldman Sachs in the early 90s, Goldman Sachs Investment Bank. Because this gave him the tools to develop various venture capitalist and political enterprises. The most curious example must be the Biosphere 2 project in Arizona. For those who don't know it, Biosphere 2 was the largest closed ecosystem ever created on Earth, with the purpose to test the possibility of future Mars colonization by creating an alternative, a second atmosphere, you could say. So within the biosphere there are various animals and plants. It's a kind of weird, contemporary, hyper-techno version of the Ark of Noah. So it tries to reproduce several forms of climate and plant growth from Earth in order to build a second atmosphere on another planet, like on Mars, for example. And Bannon joined this project at the time that it was in a huge crisis, because people couldn't survive in the biosphere, plants were dying, insects were taking over everything. The debt ran in the millions of dollars. And Bannon stepped in and proposed to repurpose Biosphere 2 as a model of investigating climate change. So he involved the University of Arizona to fund the project, and suggested, seeing that there's an excess of CO2 in the biosphere, this would be a perfect way of testing future responses of planets and animals and insects to possible forms of climate change. This is, of course, in complete contrast to the crucial role of Bannon in convincing Trump to pull out of the Paris Climate Agreement. So here we are still in the 90s. We are still talking of a Bannon who's much more influenced by a kind of Hollywood liberal culture. And of course, he's a venture capitalist. He will develop any project that sells. At that time, there was a general consensus between Republicans and Democrats that climate change was real. Even capitalism will need a planet to exploit. If there's no planet left, then that doesn't work either. It is also an interesting project. Here it's shown in the exhibition, Steve Bannon, a propaganda retrospective, because the biosphere is a very powerful metaphor for propaganda itself. Because its focus is not to create, it doesn't focus on one specific plant or one specific animal. It focuses on a complete engineered environment, a second reality. And that becomes an embodied reality for those who actually live inside the biosphere. So although Bannon didn't join this project as a propaganda operation, it is an interesting metaphor for how propaganda aims to operate. Now this background in Goldman Sachs was crucial also for other endeavors. One of them, extremely famous, is the Breitbart news platform, a crucial news platform, self-declared home of the alt-right, that supported, of course, Trump in his presidential bid, founded by the late Andrew Breitbart. Bannon was the one who co-organized the funding of this platform, of which you see here some of its extremely obnoxious and racist headlines. He arranged the funding through the ultra-conservative multimillionaire Mercer family and the Mercer Foundation. After Breitbart died, Bannon himself became the editor-in-chief of Breitbart News, so he had his own media channel in that sense. And the same funding source, the Mercer family, he used to organize the anti-Obama Tea Party movement, for those who still remember, and later on the campaign for Trump. So just to say that what is important is that as a propagandist, Bannon organized the political, the financial, but also the media infrastructure, which is necessary to create his own tools to assault an existing reality, to start shaping it on various levels, politically, financially, on a media level, after the vision of the Nationalist International. But the less highlighted but very important aspect of Bannon's work is that of a propaganda artist, as an instigator of new narratives, particularly in the domain of film. Between 2004 and 2016, as you can see here, he realized 9 documentary-styled film pamphlets. This is a bit of a weird genre. I don't know if it necessarily exists as such. He makes films that look like documentaries, but essentially are a kind of political pamphlets. And when you explore these 9 films, as we've tried to do in the exhibition in Rotterdam, you can essentially examine the cultural and ideological substructure of what we would come to know as Trumpism. That is to say that Bannon, from the first film in 2004 on, developed the narratives that we are familiar with as Trumpism today, but that they are in origin a Bannonism. And we can see this already in his first film, In the Face of Evil, Reagan's War in Word and Deed from 2004. His obsessions with strong national leadership. In this film, Reagan is portrayed as the sole defender of the Christian nation in a lone fight against communist evil. Bannon denounces the appeasers, diplomats, peace movements that aim to negotiate the Cold War in a peaceful manner. And instead, he ends the film with images of the attacks on the Twin Towers. And from the smoke of the Twin Towers, as you can see if you look closely, we see the ghost, the figure of Osama bin Laden appearing. Essentially, his plea with his first film, in Bannon's first film, is a 21st century Reagan, to fight with the same conviction as Reagan the threat of Islamic terrorism. And it proposes a particular philosophy that is quite crucial to understand Bannon's work. His philosophy of a cyclical return of evil. For Bannon, the fight against Nazism, against communism, against Islamic terrorism, they are all part of the same reincarnations of what he in this film calls the beast. He follows, in this analysis or in this idea of a cyclical return of evil, he follows the obscure fringe sciences of William Strauss and Neil Ho in a book called The Fourth Turning from 1997. And it is Bannon's convictions, just like the authors of this book, that time develops cyclically through 4 turnings. And that every 4th generation, every 4th turning, has to face an epic civilizational war against evil, against the beast. This cyclical war provides time and again the ground for a societal rebirth. So the inevitable decline of the 4th turning is also the beginning of a new first turning. And this rebirth for Bannon has this particular name, his ideological doctrine that we could summarize as white Christian economic nationalism. This is the vision that has to rebirth out of the ashes of the Great War of the 4th turning. And just to give you an impression, and also for those who are going to stay to watch the film of Curtis and might see some weird parallels, I'm going to show you a very short fragment of this film, of a film called Generation Zero from 2010. That is basically the film of this book that proposes this theory of the cyclical return of evil.
When we look at history, we see it naturally divides itself into eras or moods. We call them turnings, which are roughly a generation long. So there's a natural correspondence between these turnings. Turnings are like the seasons. Every turning is necessary. We discovered a recurring pattern, and implicit in that pattern of generational recurrence, the idea of a rhythm, a pattern, a sequence of events that comes around again. Nature likes cycles. Cities are founded, cities collapse, states rise, states fall. Families can prosper, families can wither. All follow certain repeating cyclical patterns. we end up inventing new cycles. We have the financial market cycle, we have traffic cycles, we have all kinds of modern high-tech cycles which we simply create. There are 4 turnings, each one roughly 20 years or so long, so an entire 4 turnings or a saeculum lasts about 80 to 100 years.
Of turnings that are launched by a so-called crisis war. It's a time when there's a lot of genocide, a lot of killing, a lot of starvation, usually a lot of disease. It's the worst times in history. And once one of those is over, everybody, both the victors and the losers, make a vow that was so horrible, it should never be allowed to happen again. That's really the key to understanding what happens next.
The first turning is the high, like the 50s, that comes after the crisis. It's a period of consolidation. It's a period of stable families and stable family structures. Lots of kids are born. Lots of infrastructure is built. But emotional life becomes more or less dead and begins to die out.
Baby boomers have no memory of World War II. Their childhood was the American high.
Next comes the awakening. The perfect little children of the high, like the boom generation, become young adults.
They came of age during that period of rapid social and cultural change when we changed everything about how we felt, how we thought, how we talked, how we dressed. We changed America's feelings about itself, our moral agenda.
Suddenly, their emotions break out and all hell breaks loose.
This became a generation of great passion, of youth anger that marked a rise in every age in drug use, teen pregnancy, crime, risk-taking, suicide.
Then comes the unraveling. In the awakening, the eternal truths, the verities that had built up in the high, the values, are questioned. That process accelerates during the unraveling, and restraints are broken down in personal life, in economic life, in political life. Unravelings in America have certain common characteristics. They tend to be eras of a lot of economic speculation and more stronger boom and bust cycles.
For example, line that up with the 1920s, or go back to the 1850s in America, go back to the 1760s. Consider the 1990s a decade of cynicism and bad manners, and public authority seemed to be pretty weak. You notice repeatedly recurring again these eras that feel very similar. Now, history teaches that usually third turnings finally issue into a fourth turning. Well, the fourth turning is the crisis. And history shows that if an event doesn't trigger a fourth turning leader will actually encourage one to happen, or one will simply hit us because of all the deferred public decisions that weren't made during the recent third turning. This comes to a head in the fourth turning. These fourth turnings become new founding moments of our nation's history. Obviously, one fourth turning was the period of the American Revolution. Another fourth turning was the Civil War era, in which we redefined who we were as a nation. In World War II and the New Deal, think of everything that changed in that era. We reestablished mankind's relationship with technology, government's relationship with the economy, America's relationship with the world.
So this was the fragment from Generation Zero, the film that explains, that is based, tries to narrate this theory of the fourth turning, and this fourth turning underlies, this theory of the fourth turning underlies every one of Bannon's film. His theory, Bannon applies it to this idea that with the fourth turning also comes this cyclical return of evil, this civilizational challenge from which the rebirth, the fourth turning has a new first turning has to emerge. Now this notion of evil, this notion of the beast, in Bannon's view has several components. Enemies do not only come from the outside, they are not only external, they also come from the inside. The latest fourth turning, according to Bannon, was the Second World War, as the fragment just showed, out of which the United States rebirthed victoriously. It established a free market within national borders and a nurturing and devout communal nuclear family-centered culture, at least in his reading. But this glory of the first turning was quickly threatened by a second turning that you also saw already in the fragment, the rise of flower power, progressive and feminist movement that introduced a godless individualism that would lay the seeds for the culture of liberal capitalist greed, again, in Bannon's reading. So for Bannon, there is a direct line from the hippies, from the hippie movement to the Wall Street greed and 2008 financial crisis. At the same time, there's a parallel movement, a parallel enemy from within. Not only the hippies turned Wall Street globalists, but also the cultural Marxist radicals that equally emerged from the 60s and 70s and that have continuously conspired over decades for a government takeover. In Occupy Unmasked, a film from 2012, Bannon maps a plot inspired by the work of the Jewish American community organizer Saul Alinsky, and particularly his book Rules for Radicals. And Rules for Radicals, in Bannon's view, is provides the ideological philosophy of dark alliance between the Occupy movement, unions, the Obama administration, all gathered in the same plot to collectivize the state from within and implement an authoritarian government. This book was also a really important part of the exhibition because we bought several thousand copies and distributed them for free in the exhibition. So whereas most of the exhibition is very much focused on an analysis of Bannon's work and the way that his cinematic work has influenced his work within different political campaigns, particularly the Trump administration, this document, the Rules for Radicals, we saw also as a potential handbook to start thinking about possible ways of opposing these political strategies. And of course, in many ways, Bannon himself is also well, not student of Alinsky, but he has most certainly studied the Rules for Radicals well. Now, the champions of the white Christian economic nationalist doctrine, Bannon's core philosophy, from Reagan to the Tea Party, and Tea Party figurehead Sarah Palin in particular, Trump before Trump, Bannon called her. For her, he made her very own biopic, The Undefeated, in the hope that she would challenge Obama for his second term, but she refused. And then we find today Trump and the alliances that are shaping the Nationalist International. This group is tasked, in Bannon's view, to face both these domestic and foreign enemies. The cultural Marxists plotting to take power on the university and the street, the globalist elite that used their hippie-inspired greed to establish a global party of Davos, referring to the yearly gatherings of the World Economic Forum in Davos in Switzerland, and the manifold incarnations of external forms of evil, ranging from Al-Qaeda to the Islamic State. Now, so much about the content of Bannon's films. His particular brand of pamphletic films, the forms of his films, Bannon refers to them as kinetic cinema. And it is inspired, in his words, by the work of Leni Riefenstahl, Sergei Eisenstein, and Michael Moore. Of course, very provocatively combining propaganda filmmakers from the Soviet Union to the communist regime to the progressive left in the United States, in the case of Michael Moore. I think Michael Moore would be one of the key figures when it comes to this model of quickly edited films, a lot of stock footage material that is being used. They are very interventionist film. They respond in the moment. They can be produced within a year. To my surprise, he actually has a composer who makes the score. So the music is not taken from a general database, but there's a kind of fast-paced approach to the production. And funnily enough, there was a review in the Witte Raaf, an art journal, about this exhibition that mistakenly said that Bannon was inspired by Adam Curtis, which is not the case. But seeing that we're looking at Curtis later on today, there is a strange parallel. More about that later. Bannon's kinetic aesthetic vocabulary, the tools of his kinetic cinema, they consist of fast-paced narratives with various experts that appear to structure a storyline. You saw it already in the fragment. Experts appear. There's also a description of which book they wrote about the American dynamic, aerodynamic, something, and they disappear again. And this is what you know about the experts. They structure the storyline, and in the meantime, there's a bombardment of thematically organized stock footage and arousing musical scores. Now, in the exhibition, I tried to gather all of the how shall we say it, the visual metaphors that Bannon uses throughout his films. So metaphors that he uses in at least more than 4 films, 4 to 9 films. One of them are predatory animals, for example, that appear in almost every film. Sharks are amongst the most popular because they illustrate subsurface economic forces that can rupture reality at any given moment. So animals always have, in his films, predatory animals have this metaphorical role. The most popular, though, in all of his films, you will find banknotes, burning, flushed, scattered, and they exemplify the evaporation of spiritual and material value in the unraveling of society nearing its fourth turning. And of course, the sentence, "In God we trust," on the American banknotes is very crucial, because in Bannon's vision, his plea for an economic nationalism means a free market within national borders under the authority of God. And the moment that humans declare themselves God, inspired by various progressive movements from the 60s and 70s, is the moment that all ethical rules and borders get lost. And thus, there is the direct subsequent economic crisis resulting from it. I don't agree with this reading, but I'm just trying to summarize it. Bannon has said, "What I have tried to do is weaponize film," end of quote. And it is a weaponization that provides a grand narrative that legitimates authoritarian power to be attributed to singular leaders fighting the perpetual threats of a multi-headed beast. The massive processes that Bannon describes, processes that are, as you saw also in the fragment, inevitable. If the crisis war doesn't happen, a authoritarian leader will step up to make it happen. There will be a fourth turning. There's no way of avoiding it. So we must provide authority to a counter figure, which is in this case also an authoritarian figure, Trump, in order to prepare ourselves for this civilizational war. And the manifold incarnations of the beast, cultural Marxists, globalist elite, Islamic terrorism, are also crucial because in the narrative of Bannon, they define who belongs to the in-group and who belongs to the out-group, who belongs to us and who belongs to them, which side appeases the beast and which side fights the beast. In Trumpism, in the rise of Trumpism, we have essentially seen how Bannon's kinetic cinema has transformed into a kinetic political campaign, twisting and turning historical narratives and symbols to the point at which the very texture of what we considered reality is torn, reconfigured into something entirely different. Is Trump accused of sexual harassment? Then Bannon orchestrates a press conference of women claiming to be raped by Bill Clinton. Is Trump accused for his lack of denouncing the alt-right during the Charlottesburg Unite the Right rally? Then Bannon points the finger at the real dangers of the alt-left. This continuous twisting and turning, this process, these exercises essentially are prefigurated in Bannon's films. In a similar vein, in the Netherlands, Geert Wilders' ideologue Martin Bosma has highlighted the bad conscience of the left, which in his reading accuses the Freedom Party, Wilders' party, of Nazism, only to erase their own socialist stake in National Socialism. In the case of Hungary, Viktor Orbán, leader of the Hungarian Civic Alliance, Fidesz, similar to Bannon, has perfected the enemies outside, enemies within narrative, warning through his state-owned media of a Muslim tsunami at the country's borders on one hand, and the pro-refugee propaganda of Jewish Hungarian George Soros and his foundation that supposedly want to wreck open the borders and let them in on the other. So here again, there's this creation of a manifolded beast. There's the enemy from within, and of course the reiteration of this kind of Jewish leftist, Jewish left alliance conspiracy that want to wreck Hungarian society, break open the borders through obscure funding directed by the Soros Foundation. And all these narratives, all these strategies today are discussed as fake news or alternative facts in what is called the post-truth era of politics. Now, as I mentioned, in propaganda studies, these terms, of course, have a longer history. In the case of FLAC, in the case of fake news, I already mentioned the equivalent as FLAC, misinformation campaigns. But in the case of post-truth, we're dealing with a more complex term. Because on one hand, of course, the dangers that the term post-truth indicates are very real. We have to fight factual misinformation campaigns, for example, when it's related to the reality of climate change and the existential threat that we are facing on that level. But we also have to ask exactly whose truth are we supposed to return to? If this is the post-truth era, this is the era after truth. So what was the truth before post-truth? And who exactly did this truth serve? And what was this normative pre-Trump society that we're supposedly have to return to? The Bush era? The Reagan era? The propaganda endeavor of the Nationalist International is to construct its own reality. It has moved far beyond the reach of any fact-checking machineries, apart from the question if there's anything to return to in the first place, a truth to return to. Their project is a cultural one, with their own pantheon of leader figures, climate-denying, cyclical, time-promoting scientists, and propaganda artists like Bannon, capable of structuring old reality into our new normal. Writer Angela Nagel, with whom I disagree on various accounts, argued that the Gramscians of the 21st century, those who make the long march through our cultural institutions in order to change politics through culture, today are rather on the side of the right, of the alt-right, than in previous times in the 20th century on the left. And of course, a very important symbol for Angela Nagel is the rise of the so-called Pepe meme, Pepe the Frog meme. It was a cartoon originally created by Matt Fury, which is absolutely not a politically oriented cartoon artist. It was a bit of kind of like student humor type of online cartoon. It was adopted by the alt-right movement and used to speak the unspeakable, but with irony. If Pepe the Frog declares the necessity of mass genocide, it looks different than when you just say that you are demanding mass genocide. Pepe the Frog can say anything. And the moment that the creators or those belonging to the alt-right are critiqued, it is very easy for them to return the critique and say, you have no sense of humor. This is irony. This is, there's ambiguity. But of course, everyone within the alt-right knows exactly what they're saying. These icons, this popularization of the icons, and of course this tweet is a crucial one because it was the moment in 2015 in which Trump retweeted a portrait of him as Pepe. This was the official cultural confirmation that there was a direct link, or at least a direct alliance, between the alt-right, their symbol of Pepe, and the Trump administration, that they were his people. But as Angela Nagel was arguing that the Gramscians of the 21st century, the alt-right, were changing culture in order to gain political power, in a way, their long march through the institution has already ended. We are already living in the age of alt-governance. The real-time cost of alt-right propaganda, the propaganda of the Nationalist International, is clear for us to see. It ranges from the rise of systemic and institutional racism, the criminalization, lockdown, and murder at sea of refugees, the decision of Salvini, leader of the League government in power in Italy this summer, to refuse entry of ships with refugees, the lawless killing of those declared terrorists, separation of migrant children from their family. We can continue. So to come back to a key question, is there a pre-existing reality to alt-reality? Is there something that we would want to return to in the first place? I don't know if some of you are familiar with the TV series The Handmaid's Tale, inspired by the 1985 book by Margaret Atwood. It has been a huge hit recently in the past 2 years amongst liberals, desperate for the Trump era to end. This dystopian series takes place in the aftermath of a second American Civil War, in which an ultra-conservative, hyper-patriarchal state called Gilead has risen to power. Women are not allowed to work, own property, money, or are allowed to study or read. And instead they are either assigned to domestic work or even to brutal labor camps. The class of fertile handmaids, the ones that you see here in the red robes with the white hats, they play a particularly important role in the series and in this dystopian society, because they are to combat Gilead's, this alternative state, infertility crisis by breeding children for elite households. And in a way, the world of Gilead could be a really good example of this nationalist international retro science fiction, because it kind of imagines a world of a mythological future past. Modern technology that is also present in Gilead goes hand in hand with what looks like traditional culture, but is actually not traditional culture. All of these symbols are completely made up. They suggest a history that is returning, but this history was never there in the first place. This is also one of the reasons why there's often been made jokes and parallels with the vision of extreme evangelical vision of Mike Pence, the vice president of Trump, and the vision portrayed in The Handmaid's Tale. Now, a crucial component in the series are the flashbacks of its main characters. Flashbacks to the liberal capitalist order from before the Second American Civil War, in which its main protagonist, June, which in the series is referred to as Offred, because she belongs to the family of Fred, so this is her new name, Offred. Its protagonist, June, thinks back, like this still shows, of jogging in the park, iPhone and Spotify at hand, makes a stop at Starbucks for a soya latte, here sitting with her boyfriend at an uber-gentrified New York hipsterish cafe. And of course, all of these flashbacks that are kind of always sepia-colored, as the past that was lost, all of these flashbacks to the capitalist liberal order, they suddenly seem like the normal we want to return to. We forget about criminal mortgage systems, the rise of the trillion-dollar company, also this summer, global austerity and precarity. All of these are desirable problems compared to the retro-futurist horror of Gilead. So in The Handmaid's Tale, we witness another kind of propaganda, another kind of cultural propaganda, but in this case of the liberal capitalist order. It stages a critique against growing authoritarianism. This is a warning against what governance under Trump can lead to. But actually it tries to reimpose the normality and desirability of the capitalist order, which, as we know, of course, has strongly contributed to the rise of authoritarian movements in the first place. So when we speak of post-truth, I think it's important to emphasize that there is not a norm to return to. There is nothing to return to. There are rather, in the propaganda struggle in which we are situated today, there are competing realities, and each tries to impose their own set of values, beliefs, and behaviors. This is the essence of the propaganda struggle. And already between alt-right propaganda as proposed by Bannon and liberal capitalist propaganda, as we can see in The Handmaid's Tale, there is a world, a reality of difference. Now, filmmaker Adam Curtis has dedicated much of his works to the mechanisms of power and propaganda, as I have been similarly discussing them so far. In his most recent work, Hypernormalization, that is going to be screened tonight, he traces the manifestation of what he considers the construction of a fake world, which Walter Lippmann in 1922 already referred to as pseudo-reality. But Curtis used the term fake world, which according to Curtis has been in construction, has been created since the 80s onwards. But this kind of depends on which film you watch, because if you look at his series Century of the Self, the fake world has been created since the 30s, but in Hypernormalization it is the 80s. Every film of Curtis proposes that there is an absolutist timeline that begins at one point and ends at another. So his own fake realities kind of differ depending on which of his works you're watching. This fake world for Curtis is constructed by, and I quote him, politicians, financiers, and technological utopians. And their aim is to bypass complex geopolitical processes, to create a simple binary world that serves their interests of power. And Curtis mentions it that the radicals, artists, musicians, and our whole counterculture, end of quote, they become part of the trickery of this fake world in which fakeness becomes the new hyper-normal, hence the title Hyper-Normalization. The core shift, in his view, in Curtis' view, this moment in which this fake world arises are the Reagan and Thatcher years, the rise of neoliberalism, the shift of power from elected politicians, from democracies, to corporations and public relations industries. And this neoliberal paradigm also transforms the nature of civic resistance. It introduces a culture of individual expression and critique. Collective action is abandoned. Instead, collective action is abandoned and replaced for individual critique. This, at least, is Curtis' reading of this rise of the fake reality, the fake world, and how it impacts the realm of art and culture. A crucial aspect of the fake world, Curtis explains, is the creation of enemies that reinforce the us versus them dichotomy, a process to which Reagan advisors refer to as perception management. And in Curtis' film, the central focus is on the framing of Muammar Gaddafi as by the Reagan administration, as a new category of global supervillain. And indeed, we would see a very similar strategy used to frame Saddam Hussein as another version of global superhero. And here, Curtis says something very crucial. Dichotomization, this binary division of the world between us and them, is a really important part of reality construction. A fascinating example from the field of war on terror propaganda are the 2 yearly top of spectacles. It's a short for top officials. They are orchestrated by the United States Department of Homeland Security Office for Domestic Preparedness, very long title, to prepare government agencies and citizens for possible large-scale terrorist attacks. So essentially, this is a government agency that creates large exercises to prepare for possible terrorist attacks or terrorist dangers. But these exercises take the form of a bizarre mass theater. They consist of fictional attack scenarios, of which you see a script here, the different phases leading up to the exercise. And they propose scenarios in which fictional terrorist organizations are preparing an attack with weapons of mass destruction. And the example that I'm showing you now is one of the top of spectacles, one of these mass rehearsals that took place in 2003. And you have to imagine that these slides from the organizers that show the different locations where these fictional terrorist attacks are going to take place. This exercise involved 8,000 government and civil participants. So 8,000 people rehearsed over a period of several days this possibility of a fictional attack. It happened on 2 locations, Seattle and in Chicago. The scenario they propose, the scenario of Top of 2 from 2003, it begins with a fictional Middle Eastern terrorist network known as GLODO. It's a short for Group for the Liberation of Orange Land and the Destruction of Others, kind of alternative version of Al-Qaeda or ISIS. In the scenario, they attack a large-scale radiological attack. You can see it here in the script design. The scenario was written down in a 200-page script. It was staged in massive decors developed by scenery production house Production Support Services, which normally makes sceneries for theater and film. And here you see an image of how this scenario then plays out in reality with all of the props, including exploded buses, collapsed buildings, burning cars, etc., and the victims of the terrorist attacks. Actual journalists were assembled at the top of 2 venue control center, where government officials continuously messaged them how the fictional disaster was fully under control. Government services and civil defense were operating to their maximal capacity to control the damage of the just as fictional Clodo terrorist group. Now, theater theorist Michelle Dent, she's a writer on contemporary theater, and she was present when this event took place. So she was a first-hand witness, and she asked herself, who is the audience in this bizarre, spectacular theater that is sold to us as an exercise? Is it the virtual citizens of Seattle? Is it the government officials, the media, the would-be terrorists? And the answer seems to be all at the same time. But not just as spectators, but simultaneously as actors. They are spectators to the disaster, and at the same time they're actors within it. They are spect actors, as the progressive Brazilian theorist and theater maker Augusto Boal has termed it, although with a very different political vision in mind. So in the process of collectively performing and at the same time being spectator to one's own destruction, the new realities of the war on terror are established. We learn to embody and perform us versus a shape-shifting enemy, one day Gaddafi, the other day Saddam Hussein, which we then come to refer to as them. We witness in Top of Two a spectacle so radical and detailed, and so inclusive of all segments of society, government officials and citizens, that it literally transforms an existing reality into a new one, through this totalizing spectacular theater, through art. So here, as Curtis says, we see how the construction of a new reality, what he calls the fake world, is structured on a simplified scheme, a simplified schema. What defines us is not the way that we deal with actual existential and complex crises, economic inequality, structural racism, climate change, but instead it's a non-existent, shape-shifting enemy that defines what we have in common. Not through what binds us, but through what collectively threatens us. And indeed, as Curtis claimed, artists are implicated to contribute to the imagination of those threats. Through spectacular theater like Top Of, but also through art, through film, to visualize countless forms of terror that could annihilate us at any given moment, contributing to a culture of perpetual fear that legitimizes authoritarian rule, mass surveillance, military interventions, etc. But if Bannon is a propaganda artist of the alt-right, and The Handmaid's Tale will be an example of a liberal capitalist propaganda TV series, then Curtis is a propagandist of a defeatist conservative left. And this becomes most clear when he declares in this particular fragment from Hypernormalization, our time, our present time, as a time with no vision for the future. Instead, Curtis says, the growth and popularization, particularly of cyberspace, from the 80s onwards within a small circle and from the 90s onwards more and more popularized. And when he uses cyberspace, it's not only the online space, it is the global technology environment. This cyberspace world, Curtis claims, it facilitates a cult of sovereign individualism, an online space of boundless self-expression, but with no collective political organization. In actuality, in reality, in his readings, all these accumulated individual expressions of all of us on our social media, our Facebook pages, etc., they do nothing but feed into the algorithms of the Facebook states, and they make a new post-political management a reality, corporate rule instead of democratic governance. Particularly the Occupy movement, for Curtis, is a symptom of this cyberspace culture, a leaderless, networked movement, more interested in self-expression and self-management than in really taking power. But considering the fact that the Occupy movement started because people were evicted from their homes, because of a criminal mortgage scheme, this was the reason that they first stepped into the park. Not because they wanted to self-manage or democratically express themselves, but because they were expropriated. They gathered because they were forced into precarity. And only by gathering, they could try to make a stance against this process of precarization. This makes clear that it is politicized people that organized the Occupy movement, not some algorithm in the online world. And Curtis' defeatism gets even more cynical, as you will see if you stay, when he discusses the Arab Spring in Egypt and calls it a Facebook-led revolution. It was corporate social media that brought, in Curtis' reading, brought people on the street to dethrone dictator Hosni Mubarak. And only some months later, it was the same Facebook that called upon them to rejoin on Tahrir Square, but this time to depose the democratically elected President Mohamed Morsi. Cyberspace, in Curtis' reasoning, has become a new realm of global managerialism. One moment it supports the revolution, then it supports the counter-revolution, and at the same time it manages both. And as a result, the current dictatorship of Abdul Fattah El-Sisi surveils now the Egyptian state equal to its cyberspace. Here defeatist conservative left propaganda shows its ugly face. Because Curtis' determination to understand and map systems of power becomes so obsessive that even when systems are not absolute, and they never really are, and this is really important, there is no absolute system anywhere. There are always gaps, there are always conflicts in the propaganda struggle, there are always moments where one system conflicts with another and new meanings and openings and possibilities arise, however desperate they may seem. But even when systems are not absolute, Curtis will argue that they must be absolute in order to complete his narration of an all-encompassing fake world over which we have lost all control. This echoes the method of a very important art historian, Igor Golomstok, who wrote a major book called Totalitarian Art in the 1990s. And in this book he argues, I don't know if you can see it well. In this book he argues that the art that was made in Nazi Germany, the Soviet Union, Fascist Italy, Maoist China, he says they are all part of the same totalitarian machinery. It's not even really the artists that are the authors. It's not even the dictators. It's the spirit. It's the force of totalitarianism itself that manifests into artistic forms. And indeed, when we look at glorified images of grand dictators, heroic soldiers, militant peasants throughout these various regimes, major differences, while indeed we can see a lot of obvious links, there are also major differences. Mao Zedong's art theory, laid out in talks at the Yan'an Forum for Literature and Art that we studied in this very space in 2013, is an example of a cultural theory that Golomstok considers as part of totalitarian art. Mao's theory on art is an example of an artistic practice that proposes cooperative produced works, cooperations between art professionals and peasant communities, with the aim to educate both. One educates the other. A really important example is the famous sculpture group Rent Collection Courtyard from 1965 that you can see here. It resulted from such a process of co-creation. Artists from the cities were sent to the province to talk and discuss with the peasant communities the history of their oppression under the former landlord, to depict it as precisely as possible, to document it almost in a journalistic way, and then collectively build this sculpture group that narrates the history from their oppression to their liberation, in this case through the declaration of the Chinese People's Republic. Now, this sculpture group, it revolutionized. If you look at it on an extremely superficial level, you can say, yes, propaganda. Socialist realism equal to Stalinism. But this group, it revolutionized various aspects of traditional sculpture. The first that you will notice maybe is that it rejected the pedestal entirely. There are no pedestals. The figures are not heighted or elevated above the person who views them. It rejects durable materials. There's no marble, they're all clay figures. They were made from clay that was also from the direct local environment. Villagers would walk past them collectively, debating their past history and the new Chinese People's Republic that had emerged recently. But this process would not be a mere viewing of artworks. There was a theatrical aspect. They would spit, throw objects at the depiction of the oppressor in the process of walking by this sculpture group. So there was a very, very particular performative dimension, not only to the creation of the artworks, but also in its experience. Now these characteristics, co-creation, removal of the pedestal, the theatrical usage, they were absent in Stalinist, Socialist, Realist sculpture, in which the monumental pedestal facilitated figures made of solid materials, towering far above the ground of the crowd, in an attempt to embody a sense of near eternity. Completely different relation also to time. So rather than describing totalitarian art, Golemstok, the author of the book, in a way he represents a totalizing historiography. He bypasses difference in order to be able to present a closed system theory. That's why I thought it was also an important example in relationship to the work of Curtis. But of course, in the case of Curtis, his totalizing narrations are even more tragic, because the Occupy movement, the Arab Spring, but also Los Indignados, Nuit debout, the Umbrella movement, Black Lives Matter, Standing Rock, these are the living embodied truth, if we want to talk about any truth in relationship to post-truth, that there are visions and that there are practices of alternative futures and world-making in our present. Hundreds of thousands of people did not take Tahrir Square or participated in many other of the examples I just named because Facebook told them so, because they were orchestrated by some algorithm. They put their bodies on the line collectively, not because a post-managerial elite asked them to, but because they collectively reclaimed power, despite violence, despite fear, pain, and death. And in these rare moments of gathering, these rare moments of performative assembly, as philosopher Judith Butler calls it, in these moments that extreme precarious people meets, the possibility of another kind of power is pre-enacted. The possibility, maybe even, of another kind of propaganda, another way of telling stories, another way of proposing narratives about where we come from, who we are, and most importantly, about who we are still to become. So, our contemporary propaganda struggle is shaped by various performances of power, each with their own infrastructures, each with their own cultural narratives, each attempting to shape reality after their particular interests. And already in the few examples that I have given, ranging from propaganda art in the alt-right, propaganda art in relationship to liberal capitalism, the war on terror, the defeatist left, Curtis, we can see that each particular structure of power performs differently as art. To say it simply, we can see that there's a particular relationship between power and form, and not every structure of power is represented through the same forms, is performed through the same forms. In recent times, we have witnessed that propaganda can bring into motion vast geopolitical processes. From the Brexit vote to the election of Trump, and of course the elections of Erdogan, re-elections of Erdogan, Modi in India, Duterte in the Philippines, many more examples of the new authoritarian world order. They take place in hazes of misinformation campaigns. And all of these events, they have shown that responding to the propaganda of the Nationalist International and various other authoritarian forms, to respond with facts is no solution, because facts need narratives. They need stories to become effective and affective. So it's extremely important, I think, to develop a kind of popular propaganda literacy, a way of collectively being able to analyze and dissect and understand the different propagandas that shape our world today. But if we want to oppose them, not just understand them, but oppose them, we will need infrastructures of our own. We will need narratives of our own to mobilize the imagination to construct a different world instead. For this, we need an emancipatory propaganda and an emancipatory propaganda art. Because the core is, if we talk about post-truth, that there is no reality to return to. There is nothing to go back to. There are only the realities that we collectively offer ourselves. I see I'm 6 minutes over time. But that's okay, because now I'm finished. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jonas. questions can be taken at any moment. Just raise your hand. If there's already someone, there's Jeroen with the microphone. So if you wait, then the whole hall can hear you. Well, you ended very much, of course, with Adam Curtis and the film that we'll show in a while. Adam was a guest at IMPAKT last festival in October, and in a way, what he said in his presentation there does resonate a bit with what you are saying now. And I don't think his critique of Occupy and the Arab uprisings wasn't that much that they were driven by the algorithm, as you put it, but more that after the initial momentum that was definitely, I think, powered by social media, that there was no follow-up, there was no grand narrative, there was no narrative that could speak to the collective. And as I remember his presentation, it was mostly there where he saw the failing of Occupy. Do you read his work differently, or how would you see that?
I mean, he might have said that on the podium, but in the film he particularly says, from the 80s onwards, we witnessed a shift of neoliberalism, parallel the emergence of cyberspace. The shift of neoliberalism means power moves to unelected forms of governance, and cyberspace becomes both a space to escape to in the form of individual expression. So the idea of collective resistance moves into individual gatherings, leaderless movements, and temporary networks online, although in time they are also recaptured and molded into this model of algorithmic public relation corporate governance. And of course, I mean, at the end, this supposed mechanism of control is very suggestive in Curtis's work. I mean, if his work would be a meta-critique on propaganda, it would be great, because just in a slightly, I mean, I would never compare Curtis to Bannon one-on-one, but in a very slight similarity as with Bannon, when you hear Bannon narrate in The Fourth Turning, in these fragments, societies rise, societies fall, families gather, families fall apart, storms begin, storms end, fruits rot, fruits are picked. There's this suggestion that very quickly, that somehow natural phenomena, human phenomena, that they are all part of the same rhythmic control. There's one force that somehow drives them all, but they're not. They're particular. There are particular differences, and Curtis' desire to find a complete narration and to grasp the powers that underlie our world becomes a form of authoritarianism itself in the way that he wants to tell the story. And I'm saying this as someone who loves watching Adam Curtis films. Mm-hmm. I think it's great. I always enjoy finding new quotes and references, but they're extremely apart from being on a research level, I think, make huge jumps that are not factual, if I can say it this way. It's also defeatist.
Isn't there maybe this sad conclusion that a powerful narrative that can create political change, or you could call it propaganda, cannot do with too much nuance? Because that's what you're criticizing Curtis for, and you're comparing him with Bannon, making leaps that are too big, really, if you really look closely. But at the same time, maybe that's what needed to speak to the imagination of larger groups of people.
Yeah, sure. I mean, just to finish with what you said previously, also, that I fundamentally don't believe that that the Occupy movement or the Arab Spring or other related phenomena have failed. Mm-hmm. They reiterate and they remutate. Bernie Sanders was unthinkable without the Occupy movement, for example. The Arab Spring is a very generic term that doesn't distinguish what has been happening in Egypt, referring to what has been happening in Tunisia or in Syria. So, in that sense, it also supposes a particular linearity. If something doesn't instantly move from one movement or moment of gathering to the other, it does no longer exist. Or maybe Curtis has a difficulty of recognizing that power has many different forms and ways. Mm-hmm. Just like today Podemos was unthinkable without the without the Los Indignados movements. So I think that the way in which new formations of power and organization merge and move and mutate is very important to be susceptible to that. Apart from that, there are fact-based propaganda narratives. We are the 99% is a great fact-based narrative. I mean, it's not completely factual because less than 1% of the world population owns the means of production of this entire world population, but it comes close enough to it. And it tries to claim and tries to articulate an alternative collectivity, an alternative us, an actual us based on our shared precarity in relationship to an actual enemy. Criminal bankers, mortgage systems that should be put in jail, prosecuted, kicked out of their tax havens and brought to justice. So this is a fact-based narrative. Propaganda narrative.
Yeah, it wasn't so much present in your presentation tonight. I think a bit more in the opening presentation at the exhibition at Nieuwe Instituut is discussion if well, propaganda, we are somehow conditioned to see it as something bad, something that is mostly right-wing or definitely not something that is part of a democracy, where I think you very much argued in that presentation that to push the political agendas that we favor, we should be a bit more propagandic. Is that still, what is your point there? What is your position there? How much of the strategies, propaganda strategies, would you want to use to support the political agendas and the political movements that you favor?
Well, I mean, my argument was that, was first of all that there has been a long campaign of propaganda against propaganda, in which we've come to associate propaganda only with totalitarianism. And the term totalitarianism, as I tried to explain through Gollumstock's work, I think is inherently faulty, because it supposes a totalization that only exists if we create that, if we narrate it as such. And what is important is that there is a long history of the role that propaganda operates within modern democracies. And you could even argue that modern propaganda resulted from modern democracy. The very first propaganda bureau was Wellington House during the First World War in the United Kingdom, considered a empire's colonial democracy, let's put it this way. So this suggestion that somehow propaganda is always external, I think is wrong, and you still see that it's a very perpetual narrative that in media, for example, in which the term is only used when it relates to North Korea, the last standing communist regimes in the world, or regimes like Putin's, which we associate with propaganda with totalitarian forms of governance from the past. But it's never applied within our own democracies. And that's why I think Bannon was a really important case study as a propagandist and propaganda artist, because he is an example that propaganda operates within democracy, without now repeating the whole, all of the different examples that would prove that democracy was never free of propaganda, and can help us to understand how can help us to build a propaganda literacy, to break with the idea or the narrative that we are somehow free of totalitarianism and it is them that live either in North Korea, Russia, or whatever, under those false or those fake world regimes. And there's also a kind of painful superiority that comes with it. Like a few years ago, there was an exhibition, Art of North Korea, in the Kunsthal in Rotterdam. Then it shows the paintings of the joyous peasants, and it suggests that somehow people that live under propaganda regimes would not be aware that they live under propaganda regimes. Whereas, of course, when it comes to these very overt forms of propaganda, everyone knows. The Nazi Party had to mandate their members to watch propaganda films, because otherwise people would not come in Nazi Germany. And a much bigger part of propaganda output was in entertainment. 90% of Goebbels' propaganda ministry focused on popular entertainment. Soap series, stories about the husband at the front line and the waiting for him to come back and the romance at the station and whatever. And in the background there are the Nazi symbols as a new normal. Everyone recognizes overt propaganda in every time period. It's covert forms of propaganda that are the ones that are most effective, both in supposed totalitarian regimes and in contemporary democracies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, propaganda is only effective when it isn't noticed as such.
To a certain extent, yeah. Because, of course, overt propagandas can be very effective because they're also about showcasing about showcasing power to create fear. If we can build this, if we can represent this or that symbol, this epic claim to power through monumental sculpture, whatever, do not even dare or think that you could ever topple. Or so there's a overt propaganda can have a lot of benefits, but generally within dictatorships, whereas democracies have a much more complex propaganda, because in order to sell the idea that we live in a free and open society, we cannot allow propaganda to be overt.
Questions from the audience? There's a question.
Hi, thank you for your talk. It was very interesting. I was wondering if, in the case of alternative forms of propaganda, what we really need is another grand narrative. Is what we need the idea that, there was a popular idea that there is no alternative to capitalism, right? There is no, I think also that's what Adam Curtis is arguing. There's no grand narrative to Occupy or whatever. I think there are possibilities for that. Like there are now suggestions, post-capitalist writings, maybe by, I don't know. I don't think Paul Mason is the best example, but there's also Inventing the Future by Nick Schoeneck. There are alternatives, but is this really what we should be desiring? Is this what we should want, another grand narrative? Because I think that was maybe one of the fears after big developments in the early parts of the 20th century, that these sort of really grand propaganda moments were in fact the end of the big sort of how do you call it, like a pressure for violence and for destruction. Maybe this could also be the argument not to have another grand narrative, but I don't know if this is the case.
Yes, I mean, I don't know if the term grand narrative is necessarily what we're looking for. We're looking for a popular narrative. And of course, a popular narrative, an effect-based popular propaganda narrative, as I support it, is one that both articulates what we have in common while creating maximum space for our possibility of existing with difference. So when we say, for example, we are the 99%, that relates to a particular economic reality. And this economic reality undermines our democratic agency as citizens in this world. That, of course, doesn't mean that we are the 99% in terms of having the same political convictions, the same religious convictions, the same. It doesn't say anything yet about our cultural expressions or our cultural communities, or it just articulates that what we need to. It just articulates the broadest sense, the broadest possible coalition in relationship to the most powerful minority, which is also very different from the us, because of course this is an us versus them divide. But it's a very different one than what you see in the Nationalist International, because they will always seek for the weakest link in society, often already criminalized groups, to be considered as them. It's a very good propaganda strategy, because that way you can also very easily get rid of your opponent. If you declare the 6% Muslim minorities in the Netherlands as the enemy, well, yeah, okay, that's a hell of a lot easier than declaring bankers or corporations or tax evading companies the enemy, because that demands a much more vast change in our political infrastructure in order to make this change happen. So I think that that popular narratives can have a collective story to tell, while at the same time being able to acknowledge and reflect difference. But in order to do it, we have to confront our opponents first. And in a way, there's of course at the end there's no way out of it, because, as I try to argue also in relationship to the post notion of post-truth, there's no reality to return back to. To suggest or now cultivate, because we are threatened by authoritarian forces, that somehow liberal capitalism, even though of course it's a lesser of evils, it was far from a solution. It has brought into being various of the disastrous consequences we see today, to which ultra-nationalist movements respond. So the only way to respond to this crisis that we refer to as the post-truth era is to impose a different norm. And there are, I think, norms and there are ideas of normative reality that are not necessarily the kind of violent, oppressive narratives that you're referring to. I don't find, for example, that as a principle, as a normative principle, that we have an equal right to healthcare, an equal right to education, an equal right to mobilization, to participation in the economy. I don't find these, or even the notion of universal basic income, I don't find these oppressive norms. I find them liberating norms. And I would happily help to propagandize a reality that enforces these as our manufactured consent, so to say.
Other questions? You just mentioned confronting your opponents, and doing some research, I came across a quote from De Groene from 2009, so it's a while ago.
Oh.
And I'll have to translate it because I have it printed here in Dutch. Did artist Jonas Staal contribute with his work to the rise of Geert Wilders? Yes, he says himself, art is entangled with politics and power. There is no sovereignty. He pleads his alliance to the promise of Joseph Beuys, unification of art and life. And then there's the German quote, jeder Mensch ist ein Künstler. I'm very curious, I mean, almost 10 years later, dealing with Steve Bannon.
I disagree with everything that you just said.
I'm quoting.
Yeah, I know, but I mean, it's 10 years ago, so... Yeah.
Okay, so you disagree with yourself, basically.
Not on everything, but predominantly, yes.
Okay, but then I'm very curious, could you say a bit more about that? What was the development and why? Why is there such a strong disagreement with your position 10 years ago?
Well, let's say that on the subject of sovereignty, like the idea of the artist as a sovereign being, the idea that our artistic expressions are somehow elevated or not don't directly result or directly related to infrastructures of power that organize our society. Here, I would still agree. I mean, and of course, this period of 2009 was, in a way, the beginning of my research in contemporary propaganda and contemporary propaganda art. But of course, the kind of understanding of what that means and what these terms means, that shifts over time. And I wouldn't necessarily head out with Joseph Beuys today, but that's another issue. With all due respect.
Yeah. I did read, I think, more in general as a comment on how in the arts there's so much attention on the alt-right, etc., that it's also somehow promotes this, popularizes this, maybe, and then similarly to, I mean, your response to Geert Wilders and acknowledging, at least at that time, that you somehow contributed to his visibility, let's put it that way, and basically saying, well, why wouldn't we create other narratives, alternatives, instead of analyzing this evil that we want to fight so much, because we're just making it more visible? And how would you see your exhibition on Steve Bannon, almost showing it, presenting him as an artist? How would you see that that piece in that in relation to that comment?
Yes. I mean, when it comes to this quote that you're referring to about having contributed to the rise of Geert Wilders, it means, I think what I said specifically is that the narrative, the rise of ultranationalism in the Netherlands is inherently intertwined with several of my works that I didn't talk about now, that have shaped and informed these works, that define their contextualization and that mutually, how do you call it, direct back or critique or try to oppose. They participate in a propaganda struggle, the way that I would say it today. So I affirm my implication in politics, and every step that you make into the realm of politics and power, in one way or another, directs and shapes it, and means that you are responsible for whatever processes that you are contributing to or bringing about. And this, I think, is a very. There are, of course, movements within art that have done similar things. The movement of institutional critique from the 70s and 80s onwards, was a movement of artists that tried to investigate the political and economic and ideological influences in the museum, in the institution that is art, and that also shapes artists subsequently. I see propaganda studies and propaganda art studies, the way that I research them, as a continuation of tracing, but beyond the question of the museum, tracing the role of art and culture in shaping alternative realities, both in the worst way imaginable and as possible alternatives. And when it comes to this question about, let's call it solutionism, that like you analyze something that is bad and then you have to come with a story about how you're going to do it different. A lot of my work, amongst which the work you referred to earlier, the New World Academy, different work I've done in collaboration with political movements, is directly related to the role of art within the popular mass movements, as I narrated or referred to it before. But I do think it's extremely important that before we enter into the propaganda struggle, or when we enter into the propaganda struggle, it's also important to, once in a while, stand still and try to understand why is our world the way that it is. Mm-hmm. What are the particular forces, dominant forces, infrastructurally, on the level of narrative and culture, that direct our world today? What are the weapons and the tools that they use? How do we avoid using it's actually what the question was about just before, how do we avoid using the same tools and presenting a different narrative with the same tools, with the risk of falling into similar authoritarian problems? So for me to analyze and deconstruct and try to understand the practice of contemporary propagandist practice of Bannon is a really important contribution to that. And of course, like solutionism has its own problems. We have to somehow both act and be able to reflect on our actions at the very same time. Mm-hmm. Can we go back to the PowerPoint just for a second? Yeah, this was in this very space in 2013. This was the very first session of the New World Academy, a school that I co-founded with Bak at the time, that invited stateless political organizations and movements to teach on the role of art and culture within their particular movement. So here we have Professor Sison, that I just referred to, discussing several case studies from the Filipino National Democratic Movement, which is an anti-colonial movement that developed from the 19th century to the present. And what is very important about this movement, and the way that it influenced me a lot, is that in the anti-colonial liberational movement in the Philippines, there were two propaganda movements declared. The first propaganda movement at the end of the 19th century, and the second in relationship to the Marcos regime by Professor Sison himself. But these proposed a completely different definition of what we tend to consider as propaganda today, when we use it as a word to demonize an opponent. The propaganda movement, at least as I understood it, and I should be corrected if I say something wrong, was about collectively exploring an oppressed culture, language, symbols, oppressed by the Spanish colonizers in the Philippines at the time. To explore with indigenous people and peasant communities, ally them with the countryside, explore these ancient cultures, and connect them to a philosophy of modernization, particularly in the more Maoist left movement that developed in the face of the Marcos regime at the time. So the propaganda movement was a way of exploring a historical culture and remanifesting them, merging them into a new collective future. And I think this is already a very different proposes a very different narrative of what can be propaganda, in the sense that this proposes propaganda as first of all, as a collective enterprise, as a collective process of offering our world, and offering the world that we're trying to construct, that we're trying to create, and the enormous diversity of artworks, of literature, of theater, of puppet play that developed within this movement show also that the notion of propaganda does not mean that the visual language or the practices become one-dimensional, singular expressions, that they can harbor enormous diversity, from comic books to film, from literature to theater and poetry. So this is a very, and it shows that there are many parallel histories that we can investigate at the same time. Curtis is not fundamentally wrong with many of the proposals that he does. I think he's wrong in the sense that he only wants to see one particular history, and it's the history of those who were in power and those who are still in power today. And that way you're always right, because yeah, they are the, let's say, dominant faction that shape our world today. But there are many parallel movements at the same time, alternative formations of power and art and culture that develop simultaneously, and that we have to learn and see and engage in order to make this possibility of an emancipatory propaganda a reality.
As an artist that, very much is researching propaganda, but also, as you just explained, wants to seek some kind of a political role, or at least be involved in that and investigate that. What I always find remarkable, that, and it's, of course we can understand that art is very much about asking questions, researching. I mean, your definition of the Filipino example, collective exploration, which is, but then I think to make a next step and to offer political solutions, there needs to be some kind of answers. And isn't that where art would stop and politics would begin? That art tends to be very much about asking questions, researching, discussing things. And would you want to see art evolving in a way that it is more about focused on the answers and giving these answers, and thereby being able to have this political role? Because that's where I see the difference between the two.
Yeah, I mean, also it's also funny that there's often this suggestion of presumption that asking questions is a difficult thing and giving answers is the easy thing.
I would see it the other way around.
Yeah, I would okay. Also see it. I would also see the other way around. But yeah, the way that art is cultivated is always as that which asks questions, which holds up mirrors, which shows the ambiguities and multiple realities that exist in our world without attaching to anything. Because the moment that an artist takes a political stance or takes a political position, then we call them a propagandist, and then that cannot be art, because propaganda is one-dimensional, doctrinal, ideological, etc., etc. At least in art school, this was the propaganda against propaganda art that I experienced myself. And in that reasoning, the suggestion is always that answers are the easy thing. Politics are about answers every day in the media machinery, and we should stay away from that. But good answers are extremely complex, and also I find extremely inspiring. Like another example of a slogan that I loved was by Bernie Sanders when he was trying to win the Democratic nomination from Hillary Clinton, was his call for a war on climate change instead of a war on terrorism. I thought that's such a brilliant slogan, because it's a very simple slogan, but actually what it proposes is something super complex. It says if we have invested billions of dollars into creating an infrastructure to fight a war that doesn't exist, to fight enemies that never existed, and that because we fighted enemies that never existed, they actually came into being. Like the Islamic State, you wouldn't have imagined before it appeared. If it would have been featured in a Hollywood movie, you would have said, no, racist trope, impossible, unrealistic. Like the war on terror unleashed a rogue imagination, created the problems it said it wanted to fight, even when it were not existing, and now they exist. If we can use all that infrastructure, if we have that power, and we can reapply it to something else, to the question of climate change and persecuting climate crimes, what would that result in? And I find that an extremely challenging question. Like, for example, how does the question of law relate to climate crimes and intergenerational climate crimes? My colleague Jonas Staal works on alternative trials, for example, that try to challenge exactly that. How do we prosecute Europe for the infringement of rights of refugees and for murder at sea? How do we prosecute? How do we seek justice? What is the alternative people's trial that we have at our disposal the moment that the law itself is criminal? And I think the imagination of art can help us to think of instruments to do that. And this is a very ambiguous and complex and multifaceted process that is not easy. It's about giving answers, but at the same time about making manifold realities possible.
We have a few more minutes, and there's a hand over there.
My name is Jun Saturay, and I come from the Philippines. And
Yes, June, was I in any way correct in the way that I was talking about the propaganda movement? Because if it's wrong, you have to tell me.
No, I absolutely
honest.
agree. I want to contribute to what you have said about in the Philippines. In the Philippines, art, culture, and politics are so closely intertwined. It's something that you cannot separate. Each and every activist of the National Democratic Movement in the Philippines is a propagandist. He is urged to do propaganda work among the masses. That is one of our central tasks. And to do that effectively, we have 3 simple rules. You should expose and oppose the root causes of oppression in the Philippines, in the Philippine society. You should depict the life and struggles of the people. And third, you should offer the democratic aspiration of the revolutionary movement. It's always a combination of those 3 when you try to create an artwork or when you do propaganda work. If you follow those 3 simple rules, then you become an effective propagandist. We don't shy away from the term propaganda. It's something that is important and part of your work as a revolutionary activist.
But I also think what is very interesting about the 3 points that you're mentioning now is that they're very clear. The Filipino art historian Alice Guillermo, that just passed away this summer, wrote several books about this, the diversity and the complexity of these 3 rules. Because the way you say it is, of course, is very clear, but every of these points has an enormous complexity. First of all, the representation of struggles and forms of oppression in the present. There are forms of oppression that are also sometimes very difficult to represent. Like, how do you represent climate change? How do you mobilize a collective imaginary for the fundamental existential threat of climate change? And how do we imagine and visualize the people, those that are responsible for it, without only referring to the corporation or the state, to be precise? And what Guillermo also wrote about in a very powerful way was how social realism in the Philippines, and I had the chance to visit many of the artists with you, is the variety of media. And when we say social realism, we don't mean socialist realism, we mean social realism, the variety of media, that the same story can be told through a comic book or a film or literature, or this is extremely diverse. And then the third point that you're mentioning, in relationship to the first point, showing the conditions of oppression, it's already a complex process. The third point is even more difficult because it's about imagining the future, representing the world that we want and that we desire, that we collectively desire, that can mobilize to be willing to make the sacrifices to get there. So I think it's what you're saying is very, very powerful because it shows simultaneously a simplicity and an enormous complexity and ambiguity in what it means to be a propaganda artist.
I agree with that. It's also important that for us, it's not a singular line coming from the artist going down to your public, the public that you're communicating to. There's always a continuing dialogue between your public and the artist who is delivering the message. The public also influences the artist. So even in the event that we're planning in December about art and culture in the 50 years of the Filipino struggle for national and social liberation, we try to share our experience of how art and culture has influenced, has contributed to the struggle of the Filipino people for liberation, but also how the masses has influenced art, culture, and the artist in doing his work so that he can contribute to the liberation of the people. So it's always a dialectical. That, I think, it contributes to the complexity of that. And then because there are so many different sectors in the struggle. So each and every sector has its own ways, its own practices, its own beliefs, and its own forms. All that contributes and eventually becomes a giant wave that we hope that will be part of facilitating the liberation of the people.
I wholeheartedly support that cause.
Thank you very much for your last questions and your comments, of course. Before we leave, or before we end this session, I would like to point out, as I already said in the introduction, that the exhibition at the New Institute is still on until September 23. I would like to thank you all for being here. You can join us for the buffet after, well, I think it will be here in a few minutes. And of course, I want to thank very much Jonas Staal for his inspiring presentation. Thank you very much.